Welcome to today's Census Data Seminar for Perth. I'll commence by acknowledging the Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, and I pay my respects to their elders both past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who may be attending this seminar today. My name's Chris Libreri. I'm the General Manager of the Census and Statistical Network Division of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Joining me today to deliver the seminar is David Weymouth. David was our local Census Operations Director for West Australia during the census, and he's now the Director of our ICT Statistics section. Also here from the Bureau today are our 4 data analysts. Just wave, guys. Najib, Rose, Sarah and Jen. After today's presentation, these guys will be available to demonstrate products, to answer technical questions in relation to use of census data. So please avail yourself of that capability. The rundown for today is the seminar, the formal part of which will take about an hour. We'll go through a series of slides, presentations, discussion points. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and then we'll break for a cup of tea, and then the analysts and David and I will be available for small group or individual questions or discussion as well. So that's the rundown. So let's commence. Australia is in its 117th year, and as a nation, we've had 45 federal elections, 29 prime ministers, competed in 28 Summer Olympics, but we've only had 17 national censuses. It is thus a rare and great pleasure to share the insights that our 17th National Census of Population and Housing has about our country. In terms of the value of our census, it's used for many things. The allocation of government funds and support for elections, in terms of the distributions of seats, government planning, administration and policy development, use in other ABS statistics, use by communities, business and researchers. It's the most comprehensive and detailed picture of Australia's population and housing, and in particular how Australia is changing. I like to say that it's hard to imagine a critical decision being made in Australia without reference to a census statistic in terms of investment, policy, or any other type of major decision in this country. It's that important. 11 months ago, or 12 months ago now, Australians completed their census forms, either on one of the 8.5 million household forms we received, or 750,000 personal forms. While most people completed forms online, there were some 3.5 million paper forms posted back to us to scan. It was quite a job in terms of interpreting some of that writing in scanning, as we're about to deal with another collection. 700 of my colleagues at the ABS helped with the scanning, the recognition, the repair, and the classifying of data against our standard statistical categories. Computers did most of the heavy work, with nearly all of our 5.3 billion data transactions automated. However, there were still some 23 million clerical operations. This has helped us produce some 68.9 million pieces of data that we released on in about a month ago for the census, and that makes up something nearing 3 million tables, 2.8 million tables of data. We won't cover all of that today. In fact, we've estimated it would take 2 years to read all of the data we produced without sleep. The data has been compiled in a wide range of products and services to serve the most geeky or the most innumerate of us. As a lot of you would know, That's just the tables that we've produced through analytical products that we have. There are many, many more data items and tables that you can produce yourselves. By going to every household and every person in our country, the census provides us with our most accurate statistical product, able to provide a detailed picture of very small areas and very small population groups. The 2016 census received a high level of public support, reflected in our high overall dwelling response rate of 95.1%. The census saw some 63.3% of private dwelling respondents participate online, an increase of nearly 2 million compared with 2011. This was short of our target, which was in fact 65%, but that has provided us with a significant quality improvement due to a range of the smart features in an electronic form. It's a lot easier to read typewritten answers as well, of course. Given the issues that we had on census night, it's a remarkable recovery and a remarkable level of participation by the Australian population. A third measure of the census is what we call the net undercount. That's the net position considering all the people that the census missed but should have counted, all the people that the census counted that it shouldn't have, or counted more than once. The census's count is 1% lower than the estimate of the census night population, which is a very low figure. Part of the way we reach that conclusion is through what we call a post-enumeration survey, and that is the largest household survey that we run in this country, of over 50,000 households, and gives us a very clear indication of the quality of the census and those categories that I just discussed. The other issue about online response is that there's much higher rates of what we call auto-coding and more detail. So you can get dropped down when you talk about industry or occupation, rather than writing teacher, it will then go to what type of teacher, and examples like that. The other element of the quality of the census is, for the first time ever, we appointed an independent panel of experts to oversee the quality of the census. That was chaired by Professor Sandra Harding of Bond University and included Peter Morrison, the former head of the Census in Statistics Canada, Dennis Trewin, a former Australian statistician, and a number of academics. And their overwhelming response was that the census is fit for purpose and is of a similar quality to the 2006 and 2011 and can be used with confidence. And I trust that you can all do that. I'll hand over to David now, who'll start going through some of the data, and I think David's going to talk mainly about people, and I'll come back and talk a bit about households and families.
All right, so as Chris said, I was responsible for running the census operations in WA in 2016. And whilst that was a massive challenge, it was extremely rewarding in terms of what we get to deliver out this end. And it's really pleasing to be able to come and do this presentation and start talking about some of the outputs that have come out of that. So for a bit of context, what we'll be talking about today when we're talking about Perth, and I won't refer to it as the Greater Perth, Greater Capital City Statistical Area because it's a little bit of a mouthful. I'll talk about Perth, and Chris will probably do the same. We're talking about an area that's bounded down to Fremantle, all the way out to Armidale, and it also includes Mandurah, because one of the things that's happened with our statistical geography, and it happened in 2011, was that Mandurah started to be counted within the Perth general metro area. So any figures that we're talking about today are covering that sort of catchment area. So it's a fairly large area, but I think it's also something that typically those of us from WA would think of as representing the broader area of Perth. As a baseline, I think it's probably worth mentioning that the population for 2016 came out as being 1,943,858. So if you can keep that in your mind, which I don't think you will, we'll come back to it. We'll talk about what that means going forward. Australia's got very, very strong population growth. We've continued to have it since 1966 and continued from the 2011 through to 2016. So Australia as a whole, in 2016, we had 23,401,892 usual residents in Australia on August 9th. And that was an increase of around about 9% from 2011. So again, throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about numbers that are representing usual residents. So we count two things on census night. We count where you are on the night and where you usually live. So this will all be about where people usually live. Perth itself, so going back to that figure I mentioned before, of 1.9 mil, give or take a bit, in 2016. For 2011, it was around about 1.7 million. So that represents for Perth a growth rate of around about 12.4%. So that's considerably higher than the national. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that the census does not count Australians that were overseas on census night, and there were 600,000 Australians that were outside of Australia on that night. Coming back to the point that says that we've had considerable growth across Australia since 1966. The population has doubled since 1966, and that was double the population from 1921. And in 1921, we counted 11.6 million people. The 2016 census counted 23.4 million people in Australia, which was an increase of 8.8 since the 2011 census, so as I said, nearly 9%. And if we're looking at things like 0 to 4-year-olds, there was an increase of about 1.4 million people. So where do Australians live, if I can make this actually work? Okay, so New South Wales is still the largest state in Australia, with nearly 7.5 million people counted in the census, which is around about twice the size of all of Australia at Federation. And it's nearly a third of the Australian population today. Victoria wasn't too far away with nearly 6 million people, and Tas reached just under 500,000. So that's a reasonable climb from Tasmania. Looking at Australia's population distribution, we have nearly 80% of the population in the 3 eastern states on the seaboard, and including ACT in that as well. So, as we'd all be aware, we're a relatively small state compared to that whole eastern seaboard, but we still represent 2.4 mil, and we're still larger than South Australia NT. What was the growth like? So WA grew by 10.5%. So that's a fairly significant change. And all of the states and territories have grown. Tas and Victoria tend to be the smallest states in terms of growth, and NT, New South Wales and Queensland are growing a little faster, with growth rates between 8 and 9%. So the race between the states for the fastest growing states was between Victoria, Vic and ACT. So whilst we ran a good race and ended up with 10.5, we had the fastest growing regional. So we had the fastest growing region, within WA. The fastest growth was in ACT with 11.2% growth, and Vic was very credible second with 10.7. But as you can see, WA has increased quite significantly with 10.7%. In terms of capital cities, we can see that Darwin and Perth are pretty high up there, and Melbourne is growing faster than Sydney. So I'm an ex-Melbourne boy, so that is something that is important for Melbourneites, but maybe not so much for us over here. And Sydney is the third largest growing capital with 12.1. Sorry, Melbourne is, but it is growing faster than Sydney. Perth has grown by 12.4, whereas Darwin has grown by an amazing 13.5%, which is possibly not something you would have expected. As I mentioned, the Sydney-Melbourne debate, Melbourne's growth rate continues to be higher than Sydney's. So what about the nature of the population in Australia? So we've got an ageing population. This graph is looking at Australia in 1991. So we're not just getting larger as a population, and I don't mean that physically, although that tends to be the case as well. The population's getting larger, but we're also getting older. So when we're looking here at 1991, what we can see is a fair degree of people sitting in the below 40 to 44 range and a general tapering off. Now this is a fairly standard sort of pyramid that you expect to see with age rates at a national level, and it's called a pyramid shape. But if we overlay that with what came out of 2016, what we can see here is something that the demographers call the middle age spread. So what you're seeing is, I guess, the age of the population is slowly rising up through the age cohorts so that you end up with more people towards the middle rather than being at the bottom. So you see it sort of rounding out in a bit of a curve and then coming back in and tapering in at the top as people age. So it's nothing particularly unexpected, but it tends to be one of those things that happens as nations age. So the growth over 65 is really noticeable. With Australia having 1/25th over 65 in 1911, in 2011, 1/7, and in 2016 now 1 in every 6 people are over 65. There are 665,000 more Australians over the age of 65 now than there were in 2011. In Australia's oldest state, it is now 1 in 5 of the population. In 2016, there was 486,842 Australians aged 85 and over, making up 2.1% of Australians. And Australian women outnumber men in this age group, with 63% being female. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This year is the 50th anniversary of the referendum that ensured that Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were fully included in the census. 649,171 Australians identified as Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander origin in the 2016 census. This is an 18% increase since 2011. Nearly 3/4 of the growth is in New South Wales and Queensland, with 25% and 20% growth rates respectively. The Northern Territory has only seen 3% growth. The 1971 census counted 120,000 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, meaning the population has increased 5-fold in the last 50 years and nearly tripled as a proportion of the Australian population. Of this 650,000, 91% were of Aboriginal origin, 5% of Torres Strait Islander origin, and 4% identified as being both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. Now, if you can think back to the previous pyramid that we had that was talking about the non-Indigenous community, and we've got it overlaid here, you can see that that's got that middle-age spread going on. What we're seeing with Aboriginal, Torres Strait and Islander people is back to the pyramid shape, but it's also lower than what it was for non-Indigenous people. So in 2016, more than half, it's 53%, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were aged under 25 years. In comparison, almost 1 in 3 non-Indigenous people were aged under 25. The difference between the two populations was also marked in the 65-year and over age group. The population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 65 years and over was considerably smaller for that of non-Indigenous Australians, which is 1 in 20 or 5%, compared to 1 in 6 or 16%. Since the 1996 census, the median age for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been on the rise. 20 years ago in 1996, the median age was 20. This had increased to 21 years in 2011 and increased again to 23 years in the 5 years to 2016. The median age for non-Indigenous people was 38 for 2016. So where do they live? About 1/3 of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population lived in New South Wales, and more than a quarter, 29%, lived in Queensland in 2016. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made up over 1/4, that's 26% of the population in the Northern Territory, and that was much higher than the next state of Tasmania of 5%. In terms of capital cities, over a third, which is 35% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population lived in capital city areas, and that compares to 67% of non-Indigenous people who live in capital cities. Around half of those living in South Australia and Victoria lived in the capital city areas. By contrast, 79% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in the Northern Territory lived outside the capital city areas. So we've got a pretty diverse Australia. Come from a whole range of backgrounds, and we now have an understanding of different generations that we have. We come from over 180 countries of birth and have 300 different ancestries, with nearly half of our country who were either born overseas or had at least one parent born overseas. Now, 2016 was the first time since 1996 that we asked for the actual country of birth for each person's father and mother, rather than just Australian or overseas. In looking at this, we've given a definition here of first, second and third generation, which is that first generation Australians are those that are born overseas. Second generation Australians are those that are born in Australia with at least one parent born overseas. And third generation Australians, both they and their parents were born in Australia. I wonder if it's worth actually seeing what the population's like in this group. So have we got, could you put your hand up if you are a first generation Australian, that is you were born overseas? Okay, so hands down. And those that are second generation, so we're saying those born in Australia with at least one parent born overseas. Yep. And then third generation plus, if you like, so anyone who's both parents and themselves. Okay, so reasonable spread. Where do migrants live? So in the 2016 census, Greater Perth had a total of 700,543, which is a bit over 36% of the population was born overseas. So that's a fairly considerable amount. Over 2 million people overseas, over 2 million overseas born Australians live in New South Wales, and that has the largest overseas born population in Australia, with 34% of the overseas born population. 83% of the overseas born population live in a capital city, compared with 61% born in Australia. And New South Wales has equal second highest proportion of the population born overseas. For Australians' overseas born population, the New South Wales was still the most popular state or territory to live in 2016, with around about 34% of the overseas population. So for Greater Perth, we're talking about 36.1 or 702,000 of the population being born overseas. In comparison, Tasmania had the lowest percentage, with just over 12% of its population born overseas. But the nature of that overseas population has been changing, and changing significantly. So if we go back to 1966, the most popular area that people came from in terms of overseas population was England. And you can see there's been a fairly steady decline in that ratio since 1966 right through to 2016. If we think about the 2016 and the countries of birth for Perth, Australia was 57.3%, England 8.6%, New Zealand 3.2%, India 2.4%, South Africa 1.8% and Malaysia 1.5%. So although the most popular birthplace for people born overseas remains England, there's a significant change in the nature of where people are coming from in general overseas. One of the things that we're seeing is a considerable increase in people that are coming in from China, India and the Philippines. So let's condense that a little bit. So we've gone from looking at 50 years from 1966 to 2016 down to 2007 to 2016. So we're talking about the last 10 years. And we're still talking about Australia at this point. So it's a fairly different picture from what we were seeing before. India, very high up there with 13.7%, followed by China, then England at 7.9%, and then New Zealand and the Philippines. So what we're seeing is this dramatic change away from European descendancy or ancestry, if you like, through to a more Asian type of descendancy, through people coming in through immigration. So that's a dramatic shift. Around about 2000, when we were really thinking about what was going on with the Y2K bug, Australia had nearly twice as many overseas born people from Europe than Asia. 15 years later, 20% more of us are born in Asia than in Europe. So what does that mean for Greater Perth? So in our context, again, England still wins the race, but it's at 17.9%, India running up second at 10.9%, New Zealand 9.3%, 6.3% for the Philippines and South Africa. Now, that's out of a total population of new arrivals since 2006 of 296,920. So just noting again that this is from 2006 through to 2016. And what are the age diversity of immigrants or migrants? So this is called a coffin shape, where you can see it's tapering out around about the 65 to 69, spreading out from the top down, and then comes back in again, representing a coffin shape. Now what we've done here is done an overlay of the European-born versus Asian-born populations and their age. And what you're seeing is a much younger population for the Asian-born cohort than you see for the European-born. So that's reflecting the relatively recent increase in Asian migration. So those born in Asia had a younger age profile with a median age of 35 years. By contrast, people born in Europe had a median age of 59 years. So Australia had migration largely from European nations from the end of the Second World War through to 1975. However, in the last 40 years, it has shifted dramatically towards Asia. Let's go back. So thinking about ancestry. So ancestry is slightly different in that it's not about necessarily where you're born, it's about identification, and it's an indication of the cultural group that a person most closely identifies with. So as an example, my mother was British born, my father I think is second or third generation Australian born. I just think of myself in terms of ancestry as being Australian. I don't really have strong links with the UK or anything like that. I've visited Europe, but not the UK. And so it's really about that identification and where you think that you identify with. So it's a different cultural indicator or a different indicator of cultural diversity that can't really be picked up by something like country of birth or the birth of parents or the language that's spoken at home. So within Perth, the top ancestry responses that we had was English 39.9%, Australian 30.3%, Irish 9.8%, Scottish 9.2% and Italian 5.7%. So if you take that back and think about what we were showing earlier around immigration and where people were born and their parents were born, that's a fairly different picture that we're seeing in terms of how people are reporting their ancestry. Languages spoken at home. So whilst we're pretty renowned for having a broad accent, we're also starting to be known for the diversity of language. In 2016, there are over 300 separately identified languages spoken in Australian homes. More than 1/5 or 21% of Australians identified that they spoke a language other than English at home. Mandarin was the most commonly spoken language after English, followed by Arabic. And of those that stated they spoke a language other than English at home, 82.3% indicated they spoke English well or very well, 12.7% did not speak English well, and 3.9% did not speak English at all. 1.1% stated they spoke a language other than English, but did not state their English proficiency. This means that about 3.5% of the Australian population, or 1 in 30, either don't speak English or don't speak English well. So for Perth, our top languages spoken at home were English only, 73.5%, Mandarin, 2.3%, Italian, 1.4%, Vietnamese, 1%, and Cantonese, 1%. Religion, something that has changed significantly in terms of religious affiliation over time. If we go back and look at 1966, we had 88.2% of the population reporting they had a Christian affiliation. So it's important to note that this question doesn't talk about how were you baptised, how were you brought up. It is about your religious affiliation, and it's a self-reported question, so people report what they affiliate with. Move through to 2016 and we're at 52.1% reporting Christian. In terms of other religions, then we had the most popular religion after Christianity was Islam at 2.6%, and this is at a national level. Buddhism at 2.4%, and nearly a third of Australians reported in the census that they had no religion in 2016. In terms of Perth and religious affiliation, the top responses were Christian, 49.7%, other religions 8.1%, and no religion 32.6%. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that religious affiliation and age seems to have a relationship. So young people are more likely to report they have no religious affiliation. Young adults, so those aged between 18 and 34 years, were more likely to report not having a religion and more likely to be affiliated with religions other than Christianity than adults. Older people, particularly those aged over 65 years and more, were more likely to report Christianity, and that's at around about 70%. The religious pattern of those under 18 is most similar to those in the 35 to 49-year-olds, suggesting that the form may be completed with the parents' beliefs. So what we're saying there is, if you're under 18, then more likely the responses are going to be guided by those of your parents. In terms of Christianity, in 2016, the Brethren and the Latter-day Saints had the youngest age profile, with more than half, both 56% of their population being under 35 years. The Catholic population was also relatively young, with 44% aged less than 35 years. And there's also some difference in the rates of men and women that are affiliated with Christian denominations. So in 2016, women were more likely than men to report being Christian, with that being 55% compared to 50%. In terms of other religions, in 2016, Sikhs had the youngest age profile, and almost 3/4, that's 74%, were aged less than 35 years. Islam and Hinduism also had a young age profile, with 66 and 64% respectively under the age of 35. And a similar proportion of men, 8.3, and women, 8.1, said they had a religion other than Christianity in the 2016 census. So now we'll start having a little bit of a look at household information. I'll hand back to Chris.
I should have also acknowledged at the start of today's presentation a number of ABS alumni in the audience, so g'day to those people as well. Families and households. So couple families with children remain the most common type of Australian family in 2016. However, the proportion of Australian families they make up has decreased over time. In 1991, 54% of families were couples with children, dropping to 45% in 2016. The proportion of couple families without children and single parent families has increased since 1991. In 91, 32% of Australian families were couple families without children, increasing to 38% in 2016. Similarly, single-parent families have increased from 13% of families in 1991 to 16% in 2016. Over 900,000 single-parent families were counted in 2016, and over 80% of single parents were female. So looking at Greater Perth, you can see that those there are similar proportions. In Perth, slightly higher couples with children at 46 versus 45%, and couples without children were almost identical, and single parent families were about 1% less at 14.5%. Almost 1/4 of households, I think that's the next slide, no, that's not the next slide. That's okay. Almost 1/4 of households, or about 24%, were occupied by one person in 2016. This increased from 20% of households in 1991. There are some 2 million people living alone on census night in Australia, and about 55% of those were female. Women living alone tended to be older than men who lived alone. The median age of females living on their own was 64 years, compared to 54 years for males. The census counted 6.1 million families across Australia, and there was little change in the composition of families in the last 5 years, although there's been considerable change in the 25 years since 1991. Coupled families with children remain the most common type of Australian family. However, the proportion of Australian families that make up has decreased over time. 54% of families were couples with children, dropping to 45% in 2016. The 2016 census counted 46,800 same-sex couples across Australia. This was an increase of 39% since the 2011 census, and that counted 33,700 same-sex couples. Female same-sex couples made up just under half, or 49%. However, they are more likely to have children than male same-sex couples. So 1/4 of female same-sex couples had children, and only 5% of male couples had children. The median age of people in same-sex couples was 40 years, considerably lower than people in opposite-sex couples at 48 years. In terms of the distribution, so same-sex couples accounted for about 0.9% of all couples in Australia, and that was up from 0.7% in 2011. Across the states, in the ACT it was 1.4% of all couples. In ACT and New South Wales it was about 1%, as well as Victoria. As you can see in West Australia, it is the lowest of all states at about 0.8%. Go back to lone person households now. In 2016, as we said, 2 million people were living alone in Australia. 1.1 million were women, 0.9 million were men. Overall, 8.7% of Australians live alone, and 9.3% of women live alone, as do 7.9% of men. The peak age groups for living alone are different. As you can see, for females, that's in the 85 to 89 bracket, whereas in males, it peaks at about 89. There are fairly low rates of living alone among younger people, but this starts to increase after the age of 45 for men and 50 for women. In the census, we also ask about the need for assistance. It's not a proxy for disability, but a guide in terms of the provision of services. 1.2 million Australians have a need for assistance with core activities. That's 5.1%, and it was 4.6% in 2011. In 2016, slightly lower rates in older age groups are offset by increases at younger age, particularly in the 5 to 19 year age groups. In Greater Perth, some 25,000 females and 16,000 males over the age of 65 require assistance with core activities. We also ask in the census about the provision of unpaid care. So in 2016, 2.1 million Australians provided unpaid care or assistance to another person because of their disability, long-term illness, or problems related to old age. Of these, 1.3 million were women, and 850,000 were men. The peak age groups for providing care were from 50 to 74 years. For women aged 50 to 64 years, more than 1 in 5 were providing care, and these are still working age years in most age groups. Women were more likely to provide care than men, but this changes at the age of 80 when men have higher rates than women. providing unpaid care for children other than their own. In 2016, 1.5 million people provided unpaid care for a child other than their own. And almost 1 million of these were women and 500,000 were men. The peak age groups for people in their late 50s to early 70s. Almost 1 in 4 women in their 60s spent time providing care for a child in the 2 weeks prior to the census. For men, the peak age group was 65 to 69 years, where about 15% of men in this age group provided care. As a grandparent, I can assure you that it does happen, and most of the people that I know do it as well, and I'm sure you know people in this category, but it's a growing area for sure. Unpaid domestic work. There's been a fair bit of media attention about this, particularly the number of males in particular that do no hours of unpaid domestic work at home. So as you can see, it's something like 1 in 5 or a bit over 1 in 5 males do 0 hours of unpaid domestic work. I do like to point out, however, that 15% of females also do 0 hours of unpaid domestic work. Having daughters that have lived at home, I can assure you that that is true in a sample of 1. For Greater Perth, the stats are similar. 15% of women do 30 hours or more compared to 3.2% of men. 16% of women do 15 to 29 hours compared to 6% of men. And 26.2% of men, which is higher than the Australian average, do no unpaid work compared to 17% of women, which is also higher than the Australian averages. Let's talk a bit about personal income. Information on income is collected in the census at a personal, household and family level. This graphic and comments are about personal income. So the median, don't forget median, midpoint, not average. Median personal income across Australia was $662 per week, while the median household income was $1,438. The median personal income in Australia's greater capital cities was $701, compared with $597 for those living outside of capital cities. For Perth, the median personal income was $728 per week, which is above the Australian average, but as you can see, well below the ACT, below the Northern Territory, but above most of the other states. The other side of the coin is housing costs. We'll talk a bit about mortgage repayments and rent. So the Australian median mortgage repayment monthly is $1,755. Mortgage repayments are highest in Darwin, Sydney, Canberra and Perth. However, a higher proportion of households in Perth, Sydney and Melbourne spend more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. So you read this graphic, so the lines, the dots are on the right hand, so for you it's the right hand axis, whereas the amounts per month are on the left hand. And you can see where almost 1 in 10 households in Perth spend over a third of their income on mortgage repayments. In ACT, while the median mortgage repayment is higher than that for Australia, they have the lowest proportion of households who spend more than a third of their income on mortgage, say for Hobart. That's because they have very high median incomes. In terms of rent, the Australian median mortgage rent payment is $1,755. And actually, no, we're on that's mortgage. Median rent in Australia is $335 per week. Median rent is highest in Sydney, Darwin, ACT and Perth. More Sydney households spend more of their income on rent than other cities, followed by Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide. And you can see at least 1 in 10 households spend more than a third of their income on rent in all capital cities except for Perth and Canberra. So a different view when it comes to rent rather than mortgage for Perth. I'll hand over to David now. So that ends, I think, the data part of our presentation, and he'll talk to you a little bit about how you can access data and access products and services. I know a number of you have actually mentioned to us as you've come in that you have to leave at a certain time. Please feel free to leave when you need to, but we've only got a little bit of presentation left, and then we've got time for questions.
And I promise I won't take it personally if you leave. I'll be giving you a very, very quick overview of some of the data products that we have, and that's why we have our lovely data analyst team sitting over there that you'll be able to talk to a bit later and get more detail. So the presentation's given you a real sense of some of the depth of data that's available, but how do you get at it? A lot of these products we've had for some time, but we've made some considerable improvements to them. So we've got 6 core products. We've got the Quick Stats, Community Profiles, Data Packs, the TableBuilder Basic and Pro, the Australian Census Longitudinal Data Set and Analytical Products. What we have done though for 2016 is tried to make the data more accessible. We've removed the need to register to download data packs and to use TableBuilder. We reviewed and rationalised the community profiles to 3 key products. So we now have a general community profile, a time series profile, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's profile, and we've streamlined the look and feel of the census web pages. And one of the things we've done is updated them in terms of how they interact. So if you want to use a phone or a tablet with them, they'll rescale and you can use them on those sorts of devices, whereas in the past they were typically tied to a fixed resolution on a PC. In terms of the basic products, so Quick Stats, that enables you to quickly and easily access summary information about the people, families and dwellings in an area and compare it to state and national data. At the state and national level, Quick Stats highlights key differences between census years. One of the things I would say with Quick Stats is you have to be very, very careful that the geography that you're looking at is one that represents what you really want to be looking at, because you can have a whole range of names that are very, very similar that measure quite different things. So as an example, Bunbury will have the LGA, the Shire. It will also have an SA4 of Bunbury. So if you're playing in that space, make sure that what you're looking at is what you really think you are looking at. You do get a fair bit of aid in that space in that they present maps for the large part of what it is that you're looking at, and it's a great way of just doing that quick check of a reference point. Community profiles provide a comprehensive statistical picture of an area, detailing the characteristics of people, families and dwellings, and they cover most topics from the census form and can be used for research, planning and analysis. And that gives you a spreadsheet of data you can download and play with. So if you're looking at something a little bit more in depth than just a pre-packaged profile of a community, start looking at these. The data packs contain comprehensive data about people, families and dwellings for all available geographic areas, and they have the associated geographic information system digital boundary files, so you're able to load them into your own GIS and play with them as you like. They're designed really for clients who have existing databases or analysis systems in which the data can be loaded and manipulated. TableBuilder is an online self-help tool that allows you to build your own tables from a range of census variables and geographies, and you can even do things like in the more advanced versions of the products create custom geographies. The Australian Census Longitudinal Database, so this is the second issue of the ACLD, and it brings together a 5% random sample of data from the 2006, 2011 and 2016 censuses to create a research tool for exploring how Australian society is changing over time. Is that still due out in December? Are we thinking, or is that a little bit later? Still in December. Okay, cool. And Analytical Products, there are a bunch of articles that we produce that showcase stories from the 2016 census. We've released some, but there's plenty to come. And we actually spend time engaging with people across jurisdictions and within government, a number of places to undertake analysis on our behalf, and they co-author with us. Census microdata is for really advanced users of census data, and it's released under strict access conditions, and that includes a census sample file that is made available containing a small random sample of households and non-private dwellings that has been confidentialised to protect the privacy and security of the personal data. It will contain census characteristics for person, family and dwelling variables, and it's due in 2018, so it's a little way off. In terms of the website, if you hit the ABS website, so abs.gov.au, click on Census and away you go, you'll find all of the information about Census, and it looks a little bit like this. In fact, it does look like that. So the Census homepage, I think you can probably also access it by going census.gov.au. Not quite sure about that, but certainly if you go abs.gov.au and then click on Census, you'll get to here. This is where you can get access to pretty much everything that's available. In the middle panel, there's a link to all of the census products as well as an article at the top on which census product is best for you. So if you're unsure, that's probably a useful thing to start with. In terms of the analytical products, so the sorts of topics that we'll cover in those are things like data summary sheets and analytical articles, a snapshot of Australia, cultural diversity, religion, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, sex and gender diversity in the 2016 census. So the data that these are based on will also be available independently. So the articles provide a commentary around the data and provide a degree of explanation and explore it a little bit further than just providing you with the raw data, but the raw data is still available as well. In terms of what's coming in the future, there's a series of detailed articles that are exploring sex and gender diversity in the 2016 census, apartment living, same-sex couples, family characteristics, rural living in Australia's small towns, business owners across Australia and journey to work. And most of those will be released in the next year or so. So just very quickly looking at quick stats. So I mentioned that you see maps. Unfortunately, when you're talking about the GCCSA level, so what we're talking about with Perth, Greater Perth, it doesn't actually show you where you are on the map, and that's a bit of a limitation at the moment. But if you drill into any of the lower areas, you start to see what it is that you're talking about in a map form, so it helps make sense. Community profiles. So community profiles provide a comprehensive statistical picture of areas in an Excel format. It consists of predefined tables of census data, so you don't have to start from scratch. You've got a whole bunch of stuff that's provided for you, and it includes most of the topics on the census form. They're typically used to compare social, economic and demographic characteristics of different geographical areas. And we've reviewed these and rationalised them, so we now have 3 key products: the general community profile, a time series profile and an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples profile. Working population and place of enumeration profiles will only be available in data packs, so they become separated out from the community profiles. The tables are available for a wide range of geographic regions, ranging from the national and state level down to a statistical area level 2. If you're unsure about the geography, look up the ASGS and you'll get a bit of a feel for how that gets put together. In 2016 release, the community profiles will no longer be available at the SA1 level. However, that information will still be available in TableBuilder and has been released already. So TableBuilder is exactly what it says. You build your own tables. So you get lists of variables that you can use and you pull them together to generate a table on the fly. That allows you to explore it to your heart's content and work out what sort of things you need for your particular analysis. It is the most advanced census product, and it allows you to create customised tables, graphs and maps from census data, and it contains data from 2006 all the way through to 2016. It gives you the ability to specify cross-tabulations of census variables, create and save the custom geographies and groupings, and produce download tables, thematic maps and graphs. So guest login is available now, and as I said at the very start, we've removed the need to register, so you can now log in as a guest. And that will give you access to the basic tables. The mapping function allows you to view the data as a thematic map, and TableBuilder, once you get beyond the basic, becomes a charged service, but allows you to create custom geographic areas and grouping and compare between multiple areas. So for example, comparing between LGAs. There's two versions of TableBuilder, the basic, which is the free one. So that's designed for clients who have some experience using census data and want to construct basic tables. And TableBuilder Pro, which is a charged product, and that allows more cross-classification of the data. And that's designed for advanced census data users. The guys, the data analysts will be able to give you a demo of both versions of that. Are you doing it out there?
Two in here and two out.
Beauty. So 2 in here and 2 outside if you want to see those products. In terms of release dates for some of our products, so we've already had our main release, which was in June 2017, and that included the quick stats and the community profiles. More detailed data products are already available, and then in October 2017 we get to the real deep stuff. So if you actually get to see some of the quick stats, you'll see there's areas where the tables are empty and they're dimmed. Those will be populated in October, and you'll start to see things like employment qualifications, population mobility topics start to be populated within those things. From December, we've got additional releases like the Australian Census Longitudinal Dataset, CIFA, Census Microdata, and the homeless estimates. So we have this ongoing range of things that are coming out. That's pretty much it for the quick overview of the products. We'll see if we can take any questions. We've got a roving mic, yeah.
If you could just tell us your name and organisation, please.
No, my name is Michael, representing an industry training council. My question is regarding identifying employment by classification. Is there any indication as to proposed changes to identifying qualification types? Because obviously job roles tend to change, and when someone tries to scroll through identifying what their job role is, that doesn't really come up. Is there anything you can shed in that regard?
So that hasn't changed between censuses, as I understand it. So we use the standard classification of occupations and industry, and you can use TableBuilder to build the sort of tables that you want. That stuff won't be available till October. So I'd suggest maybe you go through that with one of the analysts if you like.
Thanks. David Crest from Urbis. The removal of additivity is a major change in methodology, probably not something that a lot of people are aware of, but my summary of it is that none of the numbers add up in census data. It certainly makes the data pack data a lot harder to work with and compare to past years. Just wonder if you can make some comments on that, and is there any plans for any future changes to that to improve it further? It's certainly a lot harder to work with.
Additivity is about you're talking about how we confidentialise tables and we perturb small numbers.
Additivity that previously they all added up.
Yeah, but we used to ensure that they all added up, and now we don't. That's basically the change that we've made. And I suppose what we found was that there was a slight possibility with additivity that you could actually consequentially identify, which was a particular issue for us. And unfortunately, the blunt way of us responding was to remove additivity. So we are working very hard, I can assure you, to try and find a way of satisfying both of those things, but we haven't been able to do it before release. But our methodology area is working on it. If you have any clues as to how we'd satisfy that, both of those requirements, we'd be very happy to talk to you.
I guess my extreme example is that at SA1 level, the number of people in Australia is 50% out for people over 100.
Yep. Yeah, so if you're using lots of this data this way, yes. If you go to community profiles, it's less. Yeah, so that's right. So yeah, it is a problem, and a number of consultants have raised this issue with us as well, as you can understand. But for the ABS, confidentiality is paramount, and it sort of overrides other requirements. I suggest you have a bit of a chat to Jen after the discussion. She's smiling. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to answer that problem though. It's quite a problem.
There was someone up the back.
Hi, I don't work for an organisation in a paid sense. I'm a volunteer for two not-for-profits, and one of the tasks I've been set with the two of them is to cross-tabulate key data, and one of them in particular is with older people. I have been using TableBuilder Basic because that's what I can afford as a volunteer and what the organisations can afford. And I wanted to query your comments about it being for sophisticated users. I'm hardly one of those. I stumble over the line and I can do a certain amount of number crunching. But when I went to do a couple of crosstabs, it told me that I didn't have the rights because I was in Table Basic to do those. They weren't very sophisticated. They were just basic stuff. And I did feel at the time that the information was related to people who've paid taxes all their lives and have a perfect right to know what the information is. The other comment I wanted to make was that when I did manage to do a kind of more fancy it was to do with suburbs in WA, and therefore it was big. It came up with a little tab saying queued, and after about 3 calls to your ABS help desk, I was told that unless it was below 10,000 cells, it would never appear, and I could have stayed there for all night and it would never appear in the Excel spreadsheet. Now, I did actually write and say, is there no way, third way, that people in not-for-profits who are doing it out of the goodness of their heart can access more sophisticated data without having to pay for it as a subscription? And I've had no response in 1.5 months on that question. Thank you.
So look, we have lots and lots of things for free in relation to the census. So if you're a long-term user of the census, you'd know that things like the mapping product and things like that we used to sell for thousands of dollars is all free and available now. So, and TableBuilder last census was by subscription as well, and we've made it available at some level. If there's some just basic things that you need, I suspect our people will be able to get it out for you today if it's fairly quick. But I mean, our user pays process has declined over time. We charge for much less than we used to. So that has changed over time. Suggest you have a chat to one of our guys this afternoon, and if you know, it sounds like you exactly know what you need, we might be able to just get it out for you. We've only got one microphone.
Sorry, I can't fit through there.
Have we only got one mic? Oh.
Hi, Stan Scott from the Shire of 2J. We received an email on Friday to indicate that our financial assistance grants for local government for the coming financial year had been reduced from what was projected by $98,000. So I now have to rework my budget. And they blamed the ABS for that because our population had dropped. Well, it hadn't actually dropped, it dropped below what the ABS had projected that it was. And I do wonder whether some of that may be due to a change that was made in the 2011 census that made the ordinary place of residence for mining camps, where they spent more than half their time at mining camps, as their usual place of residence. This year's census, which was all done online, the level of support for people in remote camps filling in census papers was dramatically reduced, so everyone would be making their own decisions in the dark of their donga at 11 o'clock at night. And I think there's a very good chance that the census numbers changed, not because people weren't living in mining camps anymore, although there are less, but because they filled the forms in differently. And for me, that's a $100,000 question. I think every other local government in Western Australia has the same question. We're already getting slammed on the GSTs, now we're getting slammed on the census as well. So I'd appreciate a comment of some sort.
I'm glad you asked that question. I've actually got a couple of slides to go through in relation to what happens there. So As you could imagine, there's been a fair bit of focus on the population and the change in West Australia, and we've had a number of discussions with people at various levels within government here and in Canberra. So I'll go through, it'll just take a couple of minutes, but firstly, grants and the allocation of GST is generally used with what we call the estimate of resident population, not the census count. So the census count is actually the starting point. And we go through a number of phases. We move people back home. Firstly, people are counted by the usual place of residence rather than their place of enumeration. And this accounts also for interstate visitors on census night and also removes overseas visitors. The second phase is including people who have been missed. So the second step addresses people missed or counted more than once in the census by adjusting for the undercount and overcount using the results from the 2016 Census Post-Enumeration Survey. So I mentioned that survey before as a quality measure of what we do. So we also add in the number of Australians temporarily overseas on census night using data on international travellers obtained from the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. And we apply demographic adjustments designed to resolve any other anomalies not accounted for in the survey or the resident temporarily overseas adjustments. And the last thing we do is we backdate the census back to 30th of June. So census night's the 9th of August, so we have to remove any births or deaths that weren't were accounted for in that period, and any net interstate migration or overseas migration, and you create what's called an estimate of resident population. Over time, so in 2011, we have an estimate of resident population, and over each quarter we produce ERP, and that grows over time until you get to 2016, where we do a new census and we have a recalculation of what that is, starting with the 2016 base. And that difference between the graphs is the 60-odd thousand people that we're talking about. So our projection basis was wrong for West Australia, for want of a better word. We overestimated, and there's a fairly clear reason why we did overestimate, based on the knowledge we had and the historic movements in West Australia. We kept on growing the population at a higher rate than it actually did. Population still grew by more than 200,000. So when in the adjustment, you'll see that West Australia we over-adjusted, whereas in Victoria and ACT we under-adjusted, and the new census showed us that. If you look at the estimate resident population by age in West Australia on the 2011 based ERP versus 2016, you'll see that it was overdone for nearly every age group. So it was a consistent sort of phenomenon that happened across each of those age groups. But the largest difference actually occurred in the working aged males, which I think is the point that you're trying to add together to get to a number greater than we did. So I do understand your perspective and what you're saying, but all the analysis that we've done and the survey, the post-enumeration survey, other indications from tax, from Medicare, also shows that the way that we adjusted the population intersensely was different. But I hope that's given you a bit of background as to how we got to the situation we've got to. And I know a number of places around the country have particular issues with population and population movement. A number of towns and cities in particular impacted by mining. I'm actually going to Mount Isa next week. That's got a similar type of situation as well. I don't know whether I can help you in relation to the GST distribution. I would if I could, but that's generally an explanation of what's happened. I hope that helped a bit. There's a question over here.
Hey gents, my name's Stefan. I work as a public servant here in WA. First, I wanted to thank you very much for coming and showing us off what you got here, all of you, by the way, as well. Hello. I've had a bit of a question. I don't know if you guys are the right ones to ask this, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I missed the opportunity. $122 million is a lot of money. Given that, I assume that the AEC isn't running the postal plebiscite that's coming up soon, the same-sex marriage survey, whatever mouthful thing we have to call it now. I assume they're not running it because of parliamentary approvals required or something like that. Is there a reason that ABS is more qualified to deal with this than the AEC? And also, given the fact that we're using the post at the moment, is the only reason we're not going onto an online forum, because I assume that'd be a lot cheaper, due to recent experience with online?
Okay, so in relation to the first question, the Bureau of Statistics is doing this collection because the Treasurer directed us to do it. So that's the simple answer. Under the Census and Statistics Act of 1906, so it's been there for quite some time, the Treasurer of Australia has the authority to direct the statistician to collect information about the population. So the statistician didn't wake up one morning and said, I want to do a marriage survey. It didn't sort of work that way. He actually woke up one morning and the Treasurer was on the phone and said, mate, I've got something for you to do.
We know
so we're doing
it, but could you do it again, please?
Something like that. In terms of the electronic, so we've learned obviously a lot from the census and the way that we operate, and we're completely committed to electronic as a way of collecting survey data and the future census. There's very little doubt. I mentioned the independent panel before. You can also access that through our website and their report. They report on it. We obviously do too. The quality of e-form responses is far superior to paper. People don't miss questions. In terms of write-ins, you don't have that sort of so we're with that. And something like 85% of our business surveys are responded online, so e-form. So it's definitely a mode that we're interested in. But part of the direction with this was that we would do a post, use post as a survey to get everybody an ability to contribute. I don't think it had anything to do with our ability to do it that way. So thanks for the question.
Just following on from that.
Just wait a second.
It's on the same topic. Thank you. I was just interested to know on the postal vote how you're going to account for people in regional and remote areas, because obviously the postal service is going to take longer, or there might be, I don't know, the postal vote might get lost on the way, especially if it's coming from a very remote part of Australia. How do you compensate for those types of things?
There's a whole set of FAQs on the ABS website that'll cover this in probably better detail than I'm going to. We are mailing out to remote areas first, and earlier. So we're going to get that. And people in areas where we don't have postal coverage, we'll be setting up places where people can come to us and work. So town camps and places like that. We will be doing things like that. We'll also be covering people that are overseas. We've recently put out an FAQ about the silent voters. Silent voters are people that are confidentially on the roll, so they don't want their address known, and how we're going to deal with them as well. So there's a whole range of questions that we're going to work through. We've had a pretty good response so far. We're really, really impressed with the number of people that have enrolled. I actually have 5 children, and I've always been embarrassed to admit that 3 of them, they're adults, 3 of them aren't actually on the roll. And we argue quite extensively about this. They've all enrolled. in the last 2 weeks, which is quite extraordinary, actually. So I was pretty happy about that. Question up the back there. Be good if we could get back to the census, though.
This is a census question. It's just a curious question. What does it cost to add a question into the census?
Look, somewhere between $1 and $4 million. That's our ballpark, depending on the complexity, the amount of coding. If it's a straight yes or no, it's a lot easier than if it needs some level of coding. And that's one of the other things about e-forms. In an electronic form, you can have a drop-down pick list, and it's cheap. With a paper form, you can't. You know, you're limited to the amount of space that you've got on the form, so you can't cover lots of options. And so that's actually getting cheaper over time. In Australia, censuses have actually got cheaper over time on a per capita basis. And will again, depending on the electronic outcome for this time. Over here. Oh, you want to do that? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Wayne from Department of Training and Workforce Development. With the e-form or the increase in the e-form submissions, is it likely that the quality and the depth of data for occupational industry, so ANSCO and ANSI, is clearer or, just better?
We think it will actually be better at this census, particularly in terms of when you want, like you will want a finer gradation, won't you? You want a lower level of classification. You won't just want to know about teachers, if we use that example. You'll want to know primary, specialist, whatever. And the e-form allowed us to actually ask a follow-up question with that. So when you said teacher on your e-form, it actually opened up another question with a list of the different types of teachers. On the paper form, we just accepted teacher, and then we'd have to look at where you worked to try and get a better classification, if you know what I mean. But that's an inexact science, isn't it? So we definitely expect, nearly 2/3 of responses were online, so we definitely expect a better quality in terms of the granularity of that data, for sure. That was a bad toss to lose, being the microphone person today.
My name is Grace Yun. I work for W Health Department. My question is related to the ERPs. You just mentioned about 2016 based ERPs. So I assume the next Monday, 2016 ERP come up will be 2016 census based, is it?
I believe so, yes.
And my question is about the backcast. How many years of backcast you will provide?
I think it backcasts to 2011.
Only 2011?
I'm not certain about that.
Well, 2011 we had a major revision that went back 20 years, I think it was.
Yeah.
But that was because of the size of the change. So we haven't seen the same quantum of change nationally or at the jurisdictional level to be able to go back and say, let's change it. So I don't know how far they're backcasting this time, but 2011 was a very specific.
I'll get back to you. I'll get someone to quickly drop. Can you get Denise or Beta Cho? We'll get back to you on that. But as David said, there was a major revision in 2011, and we're not doing anything like that for 2016.
They also have quite a few boundary changes as well.
That's different though.
Yeah, because boundary and population SA2 boundary change.
Well, that's different at lower levels. I don't know how far they backcast, but at Australian and state level, I don't think we backcast that far, no. Over that way.
I was just wondering how much...
So where are you from?
Oh, sorry, I'm Talia. I'm from WA Police, but it's more of a personal interest question. How much is known on your known unknowns, I guess? So people who don't fill out the census or households that don't complete it, do you have much data available on the locations of the areas where those populations are living?
Okay, so the survey will take us so far. Or are you talking about people that refuse? Is that
yes.
Okay. So actually less people refused this census than previous ones. And we think part of that was the media and whatever that was sort of playing about fines and things like that as generally happened. So last census, I think 116 people got fined, and this census so we're in the stages of processing something like 50. So it's a minuscule number of the population that actually refuse to do the census. Now, people have reasons for not doing the census, and we can impute their numbers to if they so if there's illness or a death in the family or a particular reason why people can't do that, we accept it, but we take what we can get. But actually flat out refusals is very, very few, and it's historically been that way. It's only ever been a couple of hundred people, and they are people who have flat out refused to do it. So given our population, it's an extraordinary number, and it's a wonderful response and something that's actually envied around the world in terms of the way people involve themselves with the census. And I suppose we made a rod for our own back in terms of the 9th of August, because people really want to do their census and really couldn't and got really pissed off, Now, that's understandable because they love it, even though they probably say they don't. Just here.
Thank you. My name is Robin and I'm representing a not-for-profit. But I just want to follow on from that question. Then were there many people who didn't complete all questions? That's just the follow-on. But my question relates to the religious question on the census. If I recall correctly, last time no religion was at the bottom of the questionnaire. This time it was put to the top. Does that often, when you ask a question, you know the answer that you're going to get. Does that skew in any way the answers to that question?
There is actually going to be a special analytical sheet on religion that covers that question and others. And in terms of what we call item non-response, which you're alluding to, generally less than 5% item non-response, and it varies a bit by question. Income is usually the highest item non-response. Religion, I know, was only about 5%, and religion was a voluntary question as well, so it was quite well responded to. It's difficult to measure, though, the impact of moving no religion to the top or the bottom, but as you know, if you've been watching this, it just didn't make sense that the second highest was at the bottom. So generally we would do things in order from the previous census. So when you ask about Ancestry or whatever and you get a pick list of 10, it's usually, if English is the highest Ancestry, that's what we'd put first. No religion was the second highest in the previous census, yet we were still putting it at the bottom. A number of overseas countries had the same phenomenon and did the same thing in terms of putting no religion first. But I draw you attention to that article, and the independent assessors report or our quality reports has all the items, so for every item, the level of non-response.
Sorry, my name's Jeanette from a not-for-profit. I might be wrong, but my recollection is that there were no questions on employment status as to whether people were ongoing employment, casual employment, fixed-term contract, independent contractors. And I find that very surprising that we didn't have those questions. And if I'm right in my recollection, why were they not asked?
The questions have been exactly the same in that respect since, I think, 2006. So I don't think there's been a change in that.
And the change is that they haven't been there, but that's been a huge change in our society.
Are you guys checking that?
I'm checking the Western Australia ERP question for you now. Against someone else.
We'll get back to you afterwards. We've had a couple of questions about question topics, so we're about to start that process for 2021 next year. in terms of topic submissions. So that'll be posted on our website about the topic submission process. We weren't able to change anything in this census and the previous census. So if you do have topic submissions, and that seems like a topic submission, we'd certainly like to hear about that. There's a question here.
Are we guaranteed a 2021 census, given the threat by the ABS not to do a census?
So the question is, are we guaranteed a 21 census? So that is also part of the Act of Parliament. So if we don't run a census, that will need to change. All the commitment is that we're running a 21 census. I've got a 21 census branch. We're going full steam ahead running 21, and I've had no indication from this government, and I don't think there's any commitment from the opposition to do anything other than run a 21 census to the best of our abilities. We're actually, as I said, trying to improve, reduce costs, do whatever we can as we go forward. That's certainly part of the process, but yeah, at this stage I've heard nothing other than to indicate, and we've got a whole team working on 21 census now. Covered the questions. We'll break for one more.
Hi, Jen, I'm from the Department of Health WA. I'm just wondering about when census microdata becomes available, how is it going to be available? Will it be via RADL or VDL? And do you know what's happening with the free VDL trial? Because that's supposed to end at the end of the year, but nobody can tell us.
I don't know that level of detail, but I know we've improved access to microdata amazingly. That's the terms they use.
Have you tried to use RADL?
So there will be remote access to microdata. So microdata is a finer level of data. Well, it's actually unit record level data that has been confidentialised, and it is available to people to manipulate under certain restrictions. So you use that now. Use the CURF or the confidential unit record file?
We try to via RADL, but we have a lot of problems, and we're hoping to use VDL, but there's some concern because we access VDL via the free trial, and there's rumours that that's going to end at the end of the year.
Right.
But nobody can tell us what's going to happen next year.
Okay. So you probably need to talk to the local engagement manager, who is Anita.
Yeah, Zanita doesn't know either.
Yeah, okay.
Keep her on the case. I've got a meeting with Zanita tomorrow morning, so I'll have a chat to her then about what's happening. But I'll just keep asking. Get on to Zanita. No, it's good.
And go higher and higher.
As I say to people, the use of microdata is going to be pretty critical. As you're all aware, we went through a significant privacy debate about the use and the linkage of data, and my plea to you as informed users is use it. We went through that privacy debate so you would have access to the sort of data that you need, rather than sort of just structured tables or sort of small abilities to cross-classify. You've got to use it. You've got to solve problems, policy questions, things like that, by using linked and micro data. Otherwise, we won't go there. So I think it's important that you do use it, and it's important that we make it as accessible as possible. So thank you for that question.